Okay. Well, I guess it's practically 5 o'clock. Well, where I am. So for people who are joining, you're probably looking at your screen right now and you're thinking, that's not Erin, and you are correct. My name is Carol, and I'm the host of The Gloss in Salt Lake City, Utah. And somehow I was voted to do this tonight. So, um, yeah, it'll be great. It'll be great. But one of the things I wanted to say before we kind of get into things is that I mentioned this when we had our book club this month, and that is that this can be an extremely sensitive topic for some. This can be an extremely polarizing topic for others. And whatever questions you ask or any comments you may have, I just think we don't know each other's story and that you should just exhibit kindness and compassion and just, yeah, it's just always encouraged at the gloss and here too. So that's all I want to say. But yay, let's get started. We are here with the author of, excuse me, looking for Jane, Heather Marshall. So I'm just going through Erin's notes. So Heather Marshall is the instant #1 best-selling author of Looking for Jane. She's worked in politics and communications before turning her attention to her true passion, storytelling. Heather lives with her family near Toronto, and you can visit her website at heathermarshallauthor.com or connect with her on Instagram at Heather Marshall Author. So welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Having me.
Um, okay, so let's do a little bit of background about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to become a published author?
Oh, how much time do you have?
We have an hour
Um,
total.
like a lot of authors, was writing from the time I could hold a pen, stories about squirrels in wintertime, little poems, that kind of thing. And always wanted to be a writer and kind of got in my own way. Um, it was just a thing where I thought, that's the kind of thing that other people do, that happens to other people. It's a total pipe dream. Don't even bother. I kept writing because I'm a writer. I need to write, but I never sort of pursued it really seriously because I just didn't think it was ever going to happen. And I tried to get one book published for years and had no luck at all. And I was looking for a new idea for a new story, and the idea for Looking for Jane came to me. And after years and years of rejection, I got sort of instant interest and acceptance from agents and publishers. So that sort of made my head spin. But it's one of those things that, yeah, maybe seems like kind of that overnight success sort of thing, but actually had like years of struggle behind it. It's a slog to get a book published. It's really, really tough. The odds are sort of always against you. Which just makes me more and more grateful every day that this came together and that this book particularly has sparked so many conversations among women. That was really my goal. And it's so gratifying to see that happen.
Um, so it says that you worked in communications and politics before writing.
Hmm.
What aspects of those roles helped you in crafting such an incredible story? This so far, I mean, we're only 4 months in. This was definitely one of my top books of our book club this year. Um, yeah, so can you just explain some of the aspects of those roles that helped you on your journey?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how the places life takes you and the things that you are sort of sometimes stuck doing that don't really feel like what you really want to be doing end up sort of opening doors that you didn't expect, or you end up kind of pulling some of that experience through to something that you're doing in future. I always find it interesting to kind of analyze how our lives come together that way. But obviously, I studied politics in school, and while I was doing that degree, I wrote a major paper on Dr. Henry Morgenthaler's provincial court battles in the years leading up to the 1988 Supreme Court decision that decriminalized abortion in Canada. And at the time, I thought, this would make an amazing novel. Like, why has no one done this? And that was 2011 or so. So it was
Oh,
years before I sort of came back to that. But I already sort of had that research done that was already in my head. I was researching something else entirely for my job in politics when I came across this article in the National Post about the maternity homes and how there were 300,000 women and girls that were impacted by this. And that was sort of what galvanized me to write the book. That number was just so staggering to me. And again, if I hadn't been doing research for this job I had in politics, I don't know if I ever would have stumbled onto that and would have come up with the idea. So it's kind of interesting. And then obviously, working in communications, that helps with all kinds of things in terms of marketing and publicity, but also sort of from a commercial perspective, kind of knowing what's going to move people. And with Looking for Jane, that I didn't have to stretch too far for that. And I think the content is so profoundly personal for so many people, and people of all ages, women of all ages can they say that they can find a piece of themselves in this book, that they relate to some aspect of this book in their own lives or with a close loved one. Um, and so, as I say, yeah, I didn't have to stretch too far to get people moved by this book, but being comfortable talking to people, that background in communications, lots and lots and lots of writing, and that helps sort of hone the skills. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how it all kind of led me here, but served me well in the end.
Yeah. Um, your book was an instant bestseller. What was that experience like for you as a debut novelist?
I sort of still don't believe it some days.
Yeah.
Again, coming from, I
Especially
call it my
coming from the
dad.
struggle, right? That you
Yes,
talked about. Yeah.
exactly. Rejection, rejection, rejection. And then all of a sudden, all of this acceptance. You write a book, it's kind of it's your baby, you poured your heart and soul out into it. You hope that it might get published. You hope that somebody might read it. And this just blew me away, just completely exceeded all my wildest dreams for this book. But I think I'm proud of the writing. I'm proud of the book, but I think a huge part of it was that it spoke to so many people. And that's what got them talking about it. And word of mouth is so huge for books. And I think that had a huge impact on its bestseller status and also on the longevity of that. It was on the Canadian bestseller lists for half a year, and then continued to pop up when Roe v. Wade was overturned, popped up again. So it sort of continued to stay very relevant and had this kind of staying power because I think, for better or worse, a lot of the themes in it are quite timeless, and again, kind of universally relatable in a lot of ways. But yeah, it still makes my head spin. I'm immensely grateful for it. But as I say, I think the biggest thing for me is just the fact that this story got into so many people's hands and started these conversations. I've heard from readers just sharing incredible, incredible things with me, about the conversations that then happened in their families as a result of reading this book. And as a writer, you kind of couldn't ask for anything more, especially when you write a book that's sort of inherently emotional, politicized. To hear that it kind of had a real sort of impact on people. That was, yeah, that's all I could ever want as a
Yeah.
writer.
Shifting gears a little bit before we get into the book, you
Mhm.
have a new book coming out June 1st. And I know our founder, Erin, she already read it and she raves about it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that book?
Yes, it's called The Secret History of Audrey James, and it actually comes out June 4th in Canada and the UK. I hope very, very soon to be able to share some news about the US status of that. But it's inspired by true stories. Again, I end up kind of doing lots of research, finding all of these incredible stories and going, well, I can't just pick one. So then I sort of braid them together, and make a new narrative when the themes kind of align, when there's some commonality with the themes of the stories. So that's what I did with Audrey James. So it's actually inspired by a very little known Canadian war heroine named Mona Parsons. And to the best of anyone's knowledge, she's the only Canadian civilian woman to have been sentenced to death and imprisoned by the Nazis during World War II. She and her husband were helping downed Allied airmen get to safety in the Netherlands. And I read her story. I didn't even actually, I talk about this in the author's note, but I didn't set out to write a World War II book. Like I thought, there are so many authors doing that so well. And that wasn't sort of my particular interest. But then I read this story about Mona Parsons and I couldn't not use it. I couldn't not write about this woman. She lived this incredible life. And I did want to kind of shine a bit of an overdue light on her story and pulled a couple of other true stories from Germany in World War II into this thread. But the sort of theme of the novel, the crux of it, is sort of how we learn to live in new skin after traumatic experience of all different kinds. And I really kind of wanted to explore that for a few reasons. And so I hope readers will take something from it. It's again not a beach read, which I know going into a World War II book, you can kind of make some assumptions that it's going to be pretty heavy. But yeah, I'm really excited about this book. It was in the works for about 2 years and now finally getting to production. But it is nerve-wracking having another novel out in the world. It was scary enough having everyone read one novel. Now I got to
Set
put
the
it out there
bar.
again. Yeah.
Say the title one more time for everybody
The
that's logged
Secret
in.
History of Audrey James. Yeah, you can add it to
History of
your
Audrey
TBR
James.
on Goodreads. And again, hopefully I'll have some US news soon, but if you're in Canada or the UK, Australia, New Zealand, it'll be hitting shelves on June 4th.
Great. Okay, now to the book. There's so much factual history in this book. How did you do your research? And was there something that you came across that really swung the plot or characters in a specific direction? Just touching on our group real quick in Salt Lake, I think one of the things that we found the most shocking is that the criminalization happening in Canada until 1988, because in the United States, we always think that we're the ones behind.
Yes.
And that was quite, I mean, now we are, but that
Yeah.
was quite shocking.
Yeah.
One of the
Yeah.
things to find out. So yeah, was there something that you came across that really swung it? I guess you did say your early research back in 2011.
Yeah, like really just seeing that number, that there were 300,000 women that had their babies, forcibly or coercively taken from them over this 30-year period. I just thought, I'm a feminist, I'm a student of history. I am the most likely person to have come across this fact, and I have never heard this before. This was not in any of my history books. I have never heard it. And the huge reason for that was that these girls were told to go home and never talk about it again, and they didn't. So that's why no one knew about it for so long. It was just whispered about. Um, Sorry, I've kind of lost my train of thought there. But yeah, the research in 2011, again, I kind of just had this spark of like that could be a novel. But I didn't sort of have the secondary spark of, and maybe I'm the one that's going to write that. And it was sort of yeah, the research was kind of patchy. Like the way I do it is I sort of come up with the idea for the book. I do kind of a big chunk of initial research, which for me, fortunately, because I'd written that big paper on abortion in Canada over the course of a 20-year period, I kind of could go back to that paper and find those resources. And I'd already done the research to a big extent, and it was already kind of in my mind. Did some one-on-one interviews with women that were kind of the boots on the ground in that era, which was phenomenal. Um, and then, yeah, read a lot of accounts. And it all kind of, yeah, came together. And then I kind of research ad hoc as I go through a book, where all of a sudden I'll go, oh, I need information on this, or I need to interview someone about this. And then I'll kind of pause the writing and go do the research and come back. So, yeah, it kind of, the groundwork for it was laid quite some time ago. And then I continued to do the research kind of throughout the writing process.
Right. Um, I think I'm just going to take this one question that Sujatha, I hope I'm probably butchering your name, I'm so sorry, is asking, which is, why did you use a church as the central place where these things occurred?
Because primarily in Canada anyway, they were administered by churches. So these homes were funded by the government through something called transfer payments, which is just the government going, here you go, church, administer this program. So it was all the churches and the Salvation Army that were responsible for these maternity homes.
And just kind of keeping on that topic, were there some repercussions later on where the government had to, maybe if there were lawsuits or things like that later on, take care of these families? I think you might have touched on it
So,
in your author's.
yeah, so we're still waiting on an official apology. A Senate committee said in 2017 that the government needed to apologize, and it hasn't yet. And I'm still working very actively with women that are survivors of the maternity homes to try to get that apology. We've got some good allies that are helping us get there, but it's a long road. But no, there was in this study, I think I threw the United Church a bone, if anyone noticed in the book at one point, because they were the only church that agreed to take part in the study
Yes,
and
I did
admit
see that. I do remember that part.
responsibility. Yeah. So there have been some class action lawsuits attempted a few times since I think about 2008 or 2010. Again, kind of very quietly, because so many of these women are not, they haven't even told their families they're not
Right.
about to come out as part of a class action lawsuit. So the women that are kind of visible survivors are just the tip of that iceberg. They're this tiny minority of women that are willing to come out and say, yes, this happened to me and I want something done about it. I want an apology. I want to launch a lawsuit. The others are all silent or dead. Um, so yeah, that's where the churches are at, but they were responsible for what went on at the maternity home level. Government was responsible for paying for it.
In Canada, is there a statute of limitations for these women to come
No,
forward? Oh, there's
no,
not.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's very
Fortunately.
interesting. That's
Yeah,
great. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so Looking for Jane is about abortion, which is a very polarizing topic and very timely. I'm sure you've heard from readers on both sides of the fence. I'm wondering why it was important for you to write on this subject.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a feminist. It's a cause close to my heart. It was it's hard to describe, but I think it was just this personal feeling that we've been whispering about these things for so long, and I just think it's time that we kind of talk about it a bit more. And again, I think, especially with the juncture, we're in right now in terms of women's rights being clawed back, there's just a you know, um, backlash happening worldwide on women's rights, as it does. The pendulum kind of swings, and then it comes back to the center, and it swings again. So we have to just hope that it will come back to the center. But sorry, I lost my train of thought again. I got very little sleep last night. Could you just remind me? I'm so sorry
Spoken like
where
a
we were
mother.
got a lot of makeup
Um,
on.
so, um, so why it was important for you to write about abortion.
Thank
Personally, for
you.
me, I
Thank
have my
you.
little book of my reading notes, and one of the
Yeah.
things I wrote down was the author must have such strength to choose this topic as her debut novel.
Thank you. It wasn't sort of conscious and yeah, sort of getting back to my very derailed train of thought there. It was more that I wanted to kind of highlight it's a call to arms in a sense to remind people of, okay, here's the history of it. Here's where we came from in Canada. This is what's at stake if we don't remain vigilant and continue to defend these rights. And I've heard from so many readers, particularly Gen Z and late millennials, saying, I was born after 1988. Abortion's been legal my entire life. I had no idea. And I also just never gave it any thought that someone had to fight for this, and so they were sort of expressing gratitude and interest in going to learn more. And I thought that was just so wonderful. And then readers that were actually there on the ground that are now in their, 70s were going, this is great that someone's celebrating this, right? And now there was kind of this platform to sort of talk about it and to celebrate them. Because as I say in the author's note, there were never any records. We don't know their names. So I was hoping to sort of, yeah, celebrate them and give them a voice. Because I do believe that we're indebted to these women and male allies like Dr. Morgentaler that helped pave the way for us where we are now.
Did you come across in your research, I know Janes weren't their typical term, but did you interview any Janes or anything like that along the way?
Yes, I got to speak with a couple. Judy Rebick, who I mentioned in my author's note, was one, and she was very close with Dr. Morgentaler, kind of in his inner circle. And oh my gosh, put herself through so much as part of this battle. And that was great. So there were a lot of oral histories too that I was able to access from these women. The maternity home survivors were impossible to find. I've heard from so many afterward, and that's been a hugely emotional experience for me that I
After it was
somehow
published.
didn't anticipate. I
Interesting.
didn't anticipate it. And yeah, that's been very, very humbling and extremely emotional. I still hear from people now. Um, so yeah, the interviews were great because I find with research, you can you can find anything on the internet, really. You can do all of this research in books and on the internet. But when you're interviewing someone, you get a sense of what it was like to actually be there. What did it feel like? What was happening in your body? What did it smell like? Like, what was the environment? That those things you just can't get from textbooks or information on the internet. So the interviews were critical to kind of bring that to life, that period of our history to life.
We have a great question from Rita in Toronto, and she's asking, did you get any, she loved the book, and she said, did you get any pushback to have the book set in Toronto versus the US?
You know what? At one point, briefly, early on, I considered setting it elsewhere, and I just felt a real I just felt a real call to keep it Canadian, because there's pressure to set books in primarily the States or the UK. Paris, there's a few European cities that kind of are appealing commercially, but I made that decision and I thought, you know what, I don't really care if it impacts sales or how far this book is able to reach. I really wanted to tell the Canadian story, and I never got any pushback from my UK editor or pardon me, agent or any of my editors. And when it was published in the States, I asked that question. Do we want to tweak it? And my editor said no, because it just fundamentally changes the story. And this is this story. And it's, been read by all kinds of people around the world. So yeah, I'm glad that I stuck to it because I do think it's an incredible story, and I wanted to sort of keep it authentically Canadian.
Yeah, I mean, someone who read it in the States and was raised in the States, I really appreciated learning about the Canadian healthcare system and the history. And I know the other people that come to our book club, they said the same thing. We learned so much from reading this story.
That's great.
Um, we have another question from Zara. Did you want the book to highlight the importance of religion in all this? Because this also kind of was a theme woven throughout.
Yeah, I was trying to not be overly harsh, and I do sort of describe this in the author's note too, that what was depicted was what I read. This was, the survivor accounts, and it's just sort of unavoidable that there is this tone about religion because that was such a hugely impactful driving factor in why these families felt the shame that they did, that they felt a need to, squirrel their daughters away. Um, they, one survivor told me, she said, we were treated as though we had killed someone. Like the judgment attached to it and the shame was that intense. And that jives with what I read. And in terms of religion with, the abortion angle, like I didn't dive too deeply into that because I didn't really think I needed to. Like we kind of understand that there are people on all sides of this issue, and a lot of people that fall actually in the gray area, and that's okay. There are many deeply religious people who are pro-choice, and there are many, agnostics who are anti-choice or pro-life, whatever you want to call it. So I didn't want to sort of, yeah, polarize or make too much of a binary there. And I wanted people to kind of get a little bit curious, maybe see things from a perspective that they hadn't seen before. I've actually heard from a couple of people in book clubs that were, very openly admitting, I had this bias going in. My book club is reading it. I didn't really want to read it, and it challenged me, and I'm actually kind of reconsidering or, lowering my guard a little bit on what my previous opinions were based on my religion or based on my upbringing. And so I think that's great. Like really what my dog's outside the door. Um, what I'd like with this book is to sort of, I mean, ideally, if we can all get to a place where we can just be okay with the decisions of the person beside us by just going, that's not a decision I would make. I would make the opposite decision, but they're making that one, and that's okay. If we can just, tone things down a little bit and just have a little bit more compassion and respect for other people's decisions, even if they're wildly different than the ones that we would make. I hope at some point we can maybe get there.
Yeah, yeah. It was definitely an interesting book club this month, being in a very conservative state.
Yeah.
Salt Lake is actually pretty liberal, contrary to popular belief. So our book club, we kind of all um, agreed throughout the story, but it was just interesting to also listen to everybody's story at the table and people opening up. And it's because of your book that that conversation was had. And it's conversations that need to continue to be had. I think personally, this is just my opinion. This is not a reflection of the gloss. I'll say that. But
Interest.
it was just really nice. So thank you for that. Um, moving on, I really enjoyed the three different time periods you wrote in. It was a brilliant way to tell the story of such an important issue. Did you write them in their entirety, or did you go back and forth between the generations?
So my writing process, it's very strange because I'm a very organized A type in like every other aspect of my life except for my writing. So I can't plan much. I sort of know where I'm headed. I know generally what the characters are going to do, and then I just have to sit down and write. And often scenes will come to me, pop into my brain in almost like a very sort of cinematic way. And so I just sit down and write that scene. And then I later end up kind of stitching things together. So I didn't jump around too much because I found I needed to kind of settle into each character's mindset a little bit. Whereas if I was hopping all over the place, that could get a little bit murky. But I did jump around as a scene came to me where I thought, oh, this Nancy scene, I need to go right, even though I'm currently working on Angela. Um, I think I structured it this way partly because as a reader, I actually love multiple POVs. And as a writer, I find it just allows you to give so much more of a 360 on the story. And I also wanted to show kind of not this snapshot in time of like 1987, right before legalization. I wanted to show the evolution of it over the course of decades and show sort of how so much has changed and improved, but also where we still have work to do. So that was sort of why I structured it the way I did, but I had no idea what I was biting off. No idea until I was sort of into the weeds on it and it was too late to turn back. And I thought, well, okay, here we go. The editing process was an absolute nightmare. So writing three points of view in three different timelines with a major twist and a major reveal. Anytime my agent or my editor went, oh, can we just change this one thing? I was like, oh my God. I had basically like recipe cards with sort of major plot points out on my carpet, like physically moving them around to go, okay, if we change this, what's the chain reaction of that? What's the knock-on effect? So the editing process was just wild. Um, I don't regret it in the end. It worked, and I'm very, very proud of the result. But I think that was also just kind of a newbie mistake of setting out to write something with that kind of scope. But yeah, boy, am I glad I did, because I think
Yeah.
the three perspectives in the different timelines just really made it a very sort of wholesome look.
Um, One of the questions we have is what prompted you to have Margaret assume the alternate identity of Evelyn? One of the things that our book club said was we would love to have heard more about Maggie. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Interesting you should say that, and I think it actually refers to a question that might have just popped up. So in the original version, Maggie was her own point of view character.
Hmm.
And then sort of halfway through the novel, there was this switch that was done very quietly. So you wouldn't notice it. But my agent actually said, I think four is too many. And when she
Oh.
told me, I think we need to just cut out Maggie entirely, I was like, whoa, excuse me, what? So that was the major overhaul. And I was a little bit gun shy about it at first. I was kind of skeptical. And the one Maggie chapter that we kept, this was what I came back to with my agent, where I said, I'm having this visceral reaction to cutting this chapter because it's some of, I think, the best writing I've ever done is Maggie's flashback scene. And so I found a way to keep it as kind of this explanatory chapter. So that was, yeah, a major change, and that's probably why you maybe got a little hint that there should have been more Maggie. But the decision to do that was really, I mean, I love writing a good twist. As a reader, I like a good twist, but I thought there's so much in this book about identity, with the girls that were at the maternity home, their identity being completely stripped from them to begin with. Adoptees, namely Nancy, struggling with her own identity and what that all means for her. And so, kind of playing with this idea of identity, I thought after everything that's happened and then what she does, I guess there's no spoilers because everyone's read it. Um, it didn't feel like a big stretch that this woman might want to kind of live in someone else's skin, that she might want to assume a different name. And, she was running from the law, technically. So that was kind of where that decision came from artistically. And yeah, to be honest, it was just fun to write as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit on the chapter that you thought was the best writing that you've ever done, talking about Maggie to refresh
Yeah,
our
Maggie's
memories?
flashback chapter, particularly when she's in the bathroom, that whole bathroom scene, that was a scene that came to me pretty early, out of order, and I wrote it. And it actually got me into a writer's program in Toronto that summer, when I was still like halfway through writing Looking for Jane. And that program changed my life, changed my career. And so I had sort of this emotional attachment to it. But there was just something about that bathroom scene, particularly, that I thought I can't cut this. I need to find a way to include this. And in the end, I think it worked pretty well as that explanatory chapter.
Yeah. Um, I'm just reading through some
Mhm.
questions. So yeah, you did answer that. Can you share some of the editing changes that you had to do? Have you received any harsh critiques or backlash based on the theme of the book?
I think there's some one-star ratings on online that might be people that just haven't even read the book but know the content. Um,
That's an
there
issue
was
with Goodreads.
well, yes, and I know other authors say like Goodreads is so mean. Generally, one of the best pieces of advice I was given early on was just look at the overall star rating, see how it's landing. Do not look at any reviews, good or bad, because it can kind of pitch a tent in your head either way, where you get kind of an overinflated sense of your own talent, or you think this one person on the internet thinks I'm a complete hack, therefore I am,
Yeah.
and that can cause writer's block and cause you to question yourself. So I had one star on Goodreads, and it was just all caps garbage. Which, like, honestly, at the time I was like, "Ow!" But now I kind of laugh at, and I'm like, "Okay, I think that was probably just somebody who didn't like the content, but that's fine." Um, but yeah, actually, I sort of braced for it, and particularly when it came out in the US, to be honest, I was a little bit apprehensive about what I might here. One interesting thing with the US is, and this is exactly what my publisher predicted, was that because of the content, it probably wasn't going to get picked for any of the big national, celebrity book clubs or anything like that. But they said, we think it's just going to be this consistent book club favorite. And that's precisely what's happened. So I
Interesting.
think the good thing about that is that it's flying under the radar of a lot of the people that probably wouldn't have great things to say about the content. People are sort of self-selecting in terms of reading it. So really, it's getting into the hands of people that you know that that are sympathetic to it, and then also some that might be open at least to reading it, open maybe to challenging their own thinking, or validating their own thinking, but open to reading it, and I think that's great. Um, but yeah, no, haven't had any sort of harsh blowback or nasty emails or anything like that. So that's been very, very grateful for that.
That's that's great. Just checking if there's more
Hmm.
questions. Oh yeah, you answered that. Um, you wrote looking for Jane. This is one of the things that we brought up in our book club as well, before you were a mom.
Hmm.
What changed now that you have a child of your own?
I couldn't write this book now.
Interesting.
Um,
Can you
it
elaborate?
just, oh, I talked to my husband about this around the time I was editing it. I was actually, oh my gosh, just because how the timing lined up. I had a 6 week old baby when I was editing the goodbye room scene in sort of the final round of edits. And so I was
Wow.
literally holding my 6 week old baby in one arm, typing with one, just losing it sobbing because it just hit so much harder and in just a completely different way than it had before. And I said to my husband, I don't know that I actually could have handled writing the content and like jumping into that cold water as a mom now. So I'm glad that I wrote it when I did. Because I really don't know if I would have been able to do it. I might have just kind of chickened out. Because it just, becoming a parent, it just cracks your heart open. And then it's just open, walking around in the world. And, I get upset hearing about anything bad happening to anyone because they're someone's baby. And that's just sort of how I view all humans now, as that's someone's baby. And so, yeah, reading these stories about what happened to these girls, yeah, I couldn't have done it. So I have a different perspective now. When I was doing the editing process, I was able to kind of pepper in little things about, oh, yeah, I experienced this during pregnancy. I'll kind of throw that in, even though I'd done lots of interviews and, keeping in mind that pregnancy and childbirth and all of it, parenthood, is drastically different from one person to the next. But I did sort of a survey of responses and then kind of, chose what I wanted to include and how I wanted to craft the characters' stories. So there isn't much of myself in there because I hadn't been through that yet. But yeah, I couldn't do it now. So thank goodness I did. Oh
It's
man.
interesting you bring up the goodbye room because for me personally, people were talking at our book club about Claire and her scene and how, graphic and traumatizing that was to read. And for me personally, it was the goodbye room. The goodbye room was the hardest. And
Gutted.
that and laboring alone, just absolutely traumatic. I can't believe you did that 6 weeks postpartum. Unbelievable.
That is wild. Yeah.
Um, okay, so now I was checking to see if we have more questions from the group, but I didn't see any pop up. But if you have any questions, send them through. Um, just some fun questions now.
Yeah.
If you weren't an author, what would you be?
Oh my gosh. Um, Actually a like set and props designer
Oh,
on TV and
interesting.
film. I
Yeah.
just love seeing a set with such detail. Like I go nuts for it. And actually doing like set decoration. I have like a hobby dollhouse, which is something not many people know about me, really into miniatures. Um, art, decorating, all of that. And I feel like that is just like this marriage of all of these sort of hobby interests of mine. And yeah, maybe if I was born in California, or I don't know, my life had taken a different direction, absolutely. Just designing and decorating sets for film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What book have you read early on, like one of your first chapter books that really made you fall in love with reading?
Oh, that's a that's a competitive category. Always loved the Narnia books. I've never been like a huge fantasy person. I like Narnia, I like Harry Potter, enjoyed reading The Hobbit, not so much Lord of the Rings. But there's just so much in those that really kind of resonated with me as a kid and have stuck with me since. So those early books probably. I think Judy Blume, like again, I think maybe kind of set me on a bit of a path of kind of like tackling the emotional, tough, real stuff. Definitely like, yeah, like children's books. And then I think the classics kind of teach you a lot more about language. So in sort of my teens and stuff, studying more of the classics and kind of getting your head around what you can do with language. Um, yeah, none that like sort of jump out at me immediately. Like that's the one, that's the thing that made me want to be a writer. But just over time, kind of a accumulation.
Yeah, it's interesting that fantasy is what you kind of chose in your childhood. And obviously, as a child, you're
Mhm.
not going to be reading books
Yeah,
of adult,
yeah,
adult in nature, I guess you would say.
yeah,
And then now you're writing historical
yeah,
fiction.
yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. What was the last book that you read?
Last book that I read was The Secret Keeper by Genevieve Graham, which, if you are a historical fiction lover, is just outstanding. I was actually in a real reading rut. I was having such a hard time getting into anything, which was probably terrible of me, but her book just blew me away. It was so entertaining and educational and emotional, and I was just a page turner, and I haven't had a real page turner in a long time. So if you're a historical fiction fan, that one is out now, definitely in Canada and I think in the US as well, from Simon and Schuster. But really, really fabulous. Basically the Bletchley Park of Canada, code breakers. And it was just in Whitby, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. It's Genevieve Graham, Rita, and yeah, just fantastic. And another story, it's these two twins, and one of them ends up code breaking, and the other ends up basically shuttling planes for the Brits, sort of to and from the continent, which was another sort of fascinating piece of history. These women that built and then flew airplanes from Canada for the Brits. So yes, wildly entertaining. Absolutely loved it.
Great. Oh, what was your childhood nickname?
I don't know that I really had one. Heather can't really be shortened, and that's one of the reasons my parents picked it. Um, yeah, I didn't really have one.
Okay.
Yeah.
These are Erin's fun questions. Oh, what's your favorite bookstore?
Favorite bookstore. There is one. Oh, see, now I'm gonna have to choose though. There's a bookstore that sort of inspired Thompson's Books and Antiques, which is called Balfour Books
Oh,
on College
interesting.
Street in Toronto. They actually have like Scrabble tiles spelling out their book sections, and it's just this like overstuffed little bookstore, and I just kind of love it. And in The Secret History of Audrey James, there's actually a cameo of my favorite British bookstore, which is Barter Books in Alnwick, up in the north of England. And I think it's like the largest secondhand bookstore in the world. And it has a cafe and fireplaces and a train. It's this old converted train station. And it's just so atmospheric and fabulous. So if you read Audrey James, you'll see that bookshop pop up. I couldn't
Oh, that's
resist.
very nice. Okay, we have a comment um from Vanathi. Um, oops. Okay, it says, loved this book, especially enjoyed learning about Canada since I live in the States. The only thing I wished could be added to the book is that Evelyn Maggie would have been able to also reconnect with the actual Evelyn Taylor's child since it was revealed by Agatha, the nun that she lied about the baby dying. So why did you do it the way you did?
This is the question I get the most, and my answer is I considered it, but I thought it was too tidy. And just this situation was messy, and life is messy, and I just thought that that would tie things up a little too neatly. Um, And in my mind, Evelyn's baby was adopted into a loving family because almost all of these babies were. They were desperately wanted by their adoptive parents. The difficulty is that they should never have been available for adoption if these girls didn't want to willingly give them up. So it's just heartbreaking for everyone involved, really. But yeah, in my mind, she was adopted into a loving family and lived a good life. But that was a deliberate decision to not tie that up.
So is that also your way of saying that there won't be any type of sequel to this book?
Never say never.
Okay.
People ask that one too. I would never totally close that door. Yeah, I won't say any more than that.
Okay. Okay. Um, I don't I don't have any more questions here, but if anybody in the group does have questions, please just send them in. This is a question I had to. Rita just wrote in, will this be a movie or a series?
So it has been optioned for television for an 8 to 10 part miniseries, which I do think would be the best format to tell this story.
In
For those who
Canada?
don't, we don't know yet.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, when a book or a movie gets optioned, it just sort of literally means that a production company has purchased the option to make it into something should they choose to. So it gets optioned, and then the production company will shop it around to TV networks and streaming services and say, here's a script, here's some actors that want to be part of it. Would you like to make this? And hopefully, NBC or Netflix goes, yeah, we'd like you to make that. Here's a bunch of money, go do it. And that's when they get the green light, and that's when they actually start producing it, filming it. So loads and loads of books get optioned for TV and film, and for all kinds of reasons, it never comes to fruition. So definitely won't count my chickens before they're hatched, but obviously it would be incredible to see that on screen. And yeah, I think it certainly wouldn't be exclusive to Canada. I'd be very surprised if it were
Right.
because the book is published everywhere. So yeah, so fingers crossed. Maybe we'll see it on screen one day.
Yeah, that would be great. Um, Anybody else have more questions for Heather? Oh, if the book was made into a series, who do you
Mhm.
see acting in it?
I've tried really hard to not do like my fantasy cast, just because again, I feel like it would sort of get my hopes up. There's one woman who she's actually been on a couple of Canadian TV series. I think she lives in California. Her name is Anuka Okuna. And when I was writing Alice's character, for some reason, Alice's whole vibe was Anuka Okuna. She's the only one where I have kind of some association with an actor. So if it were ever to get made, I would love for her to play Alice.
Since you brought up Alice, that was another character that we, maybe just me personally, would have loved to hear more of her story. Loved Alice
Yes. Yeah,
so much.
Alice is just such a firecracker. I loved her. She was another character that came to me very early on. And again, there's can't say too much, but there has definitely been some talk about if it were to become a series, expanding Alice's character more, which I would just love. I would go crazy for that. So hopefully if it does become a series, we will see more of Alice.
That'd be great.
In an early version. Um, Angela's character was very different, and she was actually accompanying a friend to go get an abortion. And Alice was there decades later at this other abortion clinic. And so we kind of got to see Alice's character get pulled through a bit. Angela's character got overhauled, and so that chapter fell off, but she was always kind of in my mind as this character that did that for her entire career.
That's
So to,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Because we
love to know
didn't
more about
hear
her.
too much of her story. So
Hmm.
that would be
Yeah.
great. I'm trying to see if I have any more questions that I wrote down.
Hmm.
Um, I don't, but does anybody else have any more questions for Heather? I don't see any coming through.
That's fine.
Um, but yeah, I'm looking at my notes too. Oh, and then the other person that I wrote to for my own personal consideration was Claire. I would have loved to hear more about Claire because that friendship seemed like it was unspoken that it fractured after all that occurred.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that was another one.
Yeah, there's some backstory there that I wrote that hit the cutting room floor. There's like 30% of that original draft that hit the cutting room floor and was rewritten for all kinds of reasons. So there's all these sort of little threads of characters that you don't always get to pull through the whole book, and yeah, her backstory was a little bit more expanded upon too. So
Interesting.
again,
Interesting.
perhaps I can just hand all of these things to
In a
producers one
TV
day and
series.
go, can you pepper this in somewhere? I'd love to have you include it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and then we just have a thank you for writing this amazing book. I learned a lot, as we all did. Um, yeah, thank you for sharing your knowledge of these time periods. Um, yeah, this was so great. Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
everyone.
Heather.
And thank you for reading it. Like, writers are nothing without readers. So, thank you for taking time out of your precious life to read my book and to talk about it. And I'm so glad that you had some meaningful conversations.
And everyone be sure to follow Heather on Instagram at Heather Marshall Author, and also check her out her website, heathermarshallauthor.com. And her latest book will be out June 1st or just in
June
June
4th. Yeah, June
4th,
4th
June
in
4th
Canada
in
and the
Canada.
UK. And again, I can't say anything yet, but hopefully news very soon about the US publication date.
And follow her on Goodreads, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Just be kind.
Don't write garbage.
All
Thank you so
right.
much,
Well, thank
Heather.
you, everyone.
Appreciate your
Take
time.
care. Bye bye.
Night.